Hi everyone, it's good to see you all. So today, I apologize for this, but I only have time to read one chapter from our Helen Keller book. So I apologize for that. Alright, so chapter 5, Annie Sullivan arrives. It was March 3rd, 1887. Helen did not know that this was the most important day of her life. Helen was aware that everyone in the family seemed excited. She could feel the tension in the air. Her mother bustled about the house. Things were cleaned and polished. Her mother and stepbrother dressed to go to the train station. Helen pulled her mother, wanting to go with them, but her mother said no. So if I read on, there's a picture at the train station. Finally, Anne Sullivan arrived in Alabama on the 6:30 train. Mrs. Keller greeted her in a soft voice, her blue eyes sparkling. A small crowd gathered to see the Yankee girl who was going to teach the Keller child. Alone in a strange place, Annie looked anxious, pale, and tired. On the way to the Keller farm, Annie sat in the back of the carriage and looked around her. The small town of Tuscumbia looked like towns in New England. This comforted Annie, and she relaxed. She was eager to meet her new pupil. Another picture. This looks like it must be Annie at the house, maybe, or it's just passerby, I'm not sure. And then there they are in the wagon. Helen stood on the porch. I was right, it was Helen. She felt the vibrations of the carriage coming down the lane. She stretched out her arms for her mother. Instead, a stranger walked into her arms and held her. Helen didn't like strangers. She refused to let Annie kiss her. But Helen was curious about strangers too. Helen felt Annie's face, dress, and bag. Then Helen opened Annie's bag. She expected to find the treats that company often brought her. Her mother tried to stop Helen. Finally, Mrs. Keller had to rip the bag out of Helen's hands. Helen grew very angry. Her face turned red. She clutched her mother's skirt and began to kick. No one did anything. Then Annie held her small watch against Helen's face, feeling it ticking. Helen quieted down. The tantrum passed. Helen followed Annie upstairs to Annie's room. Helen helped Annie remove her hat. Then Helen put the hat on and moved her head from side to side. Annie watched Helen and wondered how she would teach this beautiful young colt of a girl. She was not sure she could. Annie took a deep breath, but tomorrow she would start trying. The next morning, Helen was brought to Annie's room. Helen helped Annie unpack. There in Annie's trunk, Helen discovered a lovely doll. The doll was a gift to Helen from the children at the Perkins School. Laura Bridgman, the former deaf and blind student there, had made some of the doll's clothes. Annie spelled the word doll slowly into Helen's hand. Helen thought the doll was now hers. Whenever Helen wanted something, she pointed first to it, then to herself, and nodded. Pictures. And there's the trunk. But Annie had no way of knowing this. She was trying to show Helen that D-O-L-L meant doll, and that the word stood for something. Annie took the doll back. She was going to repeat the spelling of doll in Helen's hand. But Helen grew furious. She thought Annie was taking the doll back after she'd given it to her. Annie tried to take Helen's hand. Helen would not let her. Helen began to throw another temper tantrum. Annie tried to sit Helen in a chair. She wanted to calm Helen. She wanted to start the lesson over. No use. Helen got angrier and fought harder. Annie finally let her go. But Annie was not giving up. She ran downstairs and got a slice of cake. She brought it to Helen. She spelled C-A-K-E into Helen's hand while holding the cake under Helen's nose. Helen tried to take the cake. Annie spelled the word cake again and patted Helen's hand. This time, Helen spelled the word back. Annie gave Helen the cake to eat. Did Helen understand that C-A-K-E meant cake? No, not really. Helen was just copying Annie. Helen did not know that if she went to Annie and spelled C-A-K-E in Annie's hand, that Annie would realize that Helen wanted cake. Once more, Annie spelled the word doll into Helen's hand. Helen spelled back D-O-L. Annie spelled the last L and gave Helen the doll. There's pictures. Helen fled downstairs with the doll. I did not know that I was spelling a word or even that words existed, Helen later wrote. I was simply making my fingers go in monkey-like imitation. Helen refused to have anything to do with Annie for the rest of the day. Annie sighed. Teacher and pupil had a long, hard road ahead of them. The next few days did not go any easier. Helen stayed away from Annie. Would Annie be able to break down the wall that kept Helen in her silent world? She was not sure. There's a picture of it. One day at breakfast, another battle began. Helen always ate from everyone's plate. She helped herself to food as she went around the table. No one in the family tried to stop her, nor did anybody say anything. Annie was shocked. Helen was not going to eat from her plate. Helen flew into a rage when Annie kept her plate away from her. She fell to the floor, kicking and screaming. Annie continued to eat. Then Annie asked the Keller family to leave the room. Upset and confused, they left Helen with Annie, who locked the door behind them. The war was on. Annie returned to finish her breakfast. Helen tried to knock over Annie's chair. She failed. Helen began to quiet down. Then she got up and felt around the table. She realized that only Annie was in the room. Helen was confused. She tried again to steal food from Annie's plate, but Annie would not let her. Finally, Helen sat in her place. There's the table, and you can see Helen's trying to grab food from everyone instead of sitting at the table. Helen began to eat her breakfast with her fingers. Annie put a spoon in Helen's hand. She threw it to the floor. Annie made Helen pick it up. Then Annie held the spoon in Helen's hand and made her eat with it. Realizing that Annie would not give up, Helen finished her breakfast using the spoon. Next came the napkin. Annie wanted Helen to fold it. Helen threw the napkin on the floor. She ran to the door, finding it locked. Helen began to kick and scream again. Annie spent the following hour getting Helen to fold her napkin. When it was finally folded, Annie let Helen out. Helen ran outside, far away from Annie. Worn out, Annie went to her room. As you can see, she's trying to teach her she can communicate in a different way than the way she has been doing. After a good cry, Annie felt better. Annie said of these battles, to get her to do the simplest things, such as combing her hair or washing hands, it was necessary to use force, and of course a distressing scene followed. The family could not stand these scenes. They tried to help Helen. Her father could not stand to see her cry. Their helping Helen did not allow Annie to teach her, so Annie came to a decision. Annie realized that she had to live alone with Helen, just the two of them. It was the only way Annie could break down Helen's dark, silent wall. Annie talked to the Kellers. She thought they'd say no, but they didn't. The Kellers would do anything to help Helen, so Helen and Annie went to stay in the cottage near the big house. There's Annie crying on her bed after that long, hard day. So this must be the bigger house. This is probably going to be the little cottage, I'm assuming, or it's going to be the other way around. I'm not sure. Still trying to figure it out. Annie did not want Helen to know that she was only a quick run from the house and her parents. So Annie had all the furniture moved around in the cottage. Then Annie and Helen went on a long ride in the carriage before arriving at the cottage. It worked. Helen thought she was in a new, strange place. Helen and Annie had many battles in the cottage. Annie would not let Helen eat until she was dressed. Helen refused to get dressed. See, they confused her. They are in the wagon. Captain Keller watched through a window. One day, he wanted to send Annie away, but the family talked him out of it, and it was lucky that they did. Over the next 2 weeks, Helen slowly began to change. She began to obey Annie. Then on April 5th, 1887, a miracle happened. Helen was washing the dishes. Annie spelled the word water in her hand. Helen did not react. The two went outside. At the water pump, Helen held her mug under the tap. Annie pumped out the cold water and spelled water in Helen's hand. Helen dropped the mug. A look of wonder filled her face. Helen spelled back water several times to Annie. Now at last Helen understood that words stood for things. Later in an autobiography, Helen wrote, "Everything had a name, and each name gave birth to a new thought." Annie spelled many different words into Helen's eager hands. Finally, Helen asked what to... Super excited Annie. Not Annie. Helen. Well, Annie and Helen. To call Annie. Annie spelled teacher, and so Annie became teacher. At 7, Helen's world had opened at last. The wall had come down. Annie and Helen moved back to the main house. Helen made rapid progress. Annie saw that Helen loved to be outdoors, so most of their lessons were outside. Annie used the world around them to teach Helen. By the river, Helen learned geography. They dug canals and built mountains. For science, they studied nature. Helen soon knew many different plants and how they grew. Helen loved words and language. Helen memorized words easily. She learned nouns, verbs, and descriptive words. She began to understand abstract words, such as think. Helen could now talk to her family. Helen spelled what people said into Helen's hand. Then Helen replied. Mrs. Keller learned to speak with her fingers. Now she and Helen could talk. Even Captain learned to speak this way. By June, Helen knew about 400 words. Annie wrote to Mr. Anagnos. She told him of Helen's progress. Mr. Anagnos told the Boston newspapers about Helen. The papers ran stories about her. Readers wanted to know more about this deaf-blind child who was beautiful and smart. Most children Helen's age could read and write. Annie decided that Helen would learn to read and write too. Annie read books to Helen. She did this by spelling out the whole story in Helen's hand. Helen's world became filled with fairy tales, heroes, villains, myths, and legends. Annie taught Helen to write. She used a wooden writing board that had grooves on it. A paper was placed over the grooves. Helen then guided her pencil to form letters. This is how blind people learn to write. Helen had made great progress. She learned Braille, too. Braille is a system of writing for the blind. Soon Helen could read Braille books on her own. And so another world opened for Helen. Helen's life was much happier now, but she still had a temper. Helen had a name for herself when she lost her temper. She called herself the Phantom, but her tantrums came less and less often. Helen now liked playing with her little sister Mildred. Helen's mind was now free to learn, and her heart was free to love. Must be Mildred, and there's Helen. Okay, I have to pause for 1 second. I'll be right back.